Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. How are you this week, Paddy?
I'm not as fantastic as I usually am, as I've paralyzed myself. I just have like a slip disc or a bulging disc, some fucking whack shit going on in my spine. I just moved incorrectly while squatting because, my technique is awful. So, it's not actually a big deal, but yeah, my back is sore, spinal.
Yeah. And our topic this week actually is kind of related to that because, for some context here, right? So Paddy hurt his back squatting, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So had some back pain afterwards, I think in the hours after the workout, had some kinesiophobia, you could say, whether conscious or unconscious, in the sense that he was unable to get into certain movements. It was like, as Paddy said, it was like his body just wasn't listening to him, wasn't able to get into.
What I said was my nervous system is a bitch. But anyway.
Yeah, I know you said it more explicitly, but it's this is a kid's show. But his nervous system was being a bitch effectively, and that he had some very kind of subtle neurological symptoms, in the sense of maybe a bit of tingling down the leg. So with someone that kind of presents with something like that, someone on the street, a normal gym goer might say to themselves, Jesus, I got to go straight to the physio, or I got to go straight to the emergency room or whatever. And maybe in some cases that might be a really good idea. But in this case with Paddy, it was like, okay, you're probably going to be fine. Let's see how it is tomorrow. And as Paddy just said before the podcast, that things have been getting a lot better since. So that kind of relates to the topic of this podcast, which is effectively self-efficacy, resilience, self-reliance to some degree, with an emphasis on both what this means for coaches and what this means for everyday people in the gym. Okay, because what you see there with the example of Paddy hurting his back is that he had some sense of self-efficacy, of independence, that I'm in control of this situation. This is not that much of a big deal. I'm probably going to be fine, and I'll just rest for a day or two and kind of get moving again when I can. That was his perspective. So it wasn't this situation of freaking out, of care seeking, of needing care, of needing someone else to come in and take over the situation. Okay. And this is not to say that care seeking is bad. Okay. If you injure yourself, and you're unsure, you're thinking, oh my God, is this a really bad event? It might be good to go to see a physiotherapist or a medical professional to rule out something serious, so that you can go on your merry way and get back to training, get back to being physically active, etc. However,
I'm more inclined to do that if there is an acute event that I could be like,
yeah, definitely.
This was the thing. I know literally when I was squatting, it was not a freak accident. I hate when people say that, but I literally just misgrooved the rep, and my pelvis tucked under, and it wasn't even that painful while I did the rep. I finished the rep because obviously I'm fucking savage. You know yourself, Gary. But I finished it, but I was like, oh yeah, actually, that wasn't great. And then I could feel already that kind of hesitance to move. Your body just kind of going, oh, just don't move there for a second. While I was unracking, because I was like, all right, look, that's my workout done. I was like, won't go, won't push it. Because I had to walk home as well, you know yourself. So just unracked the weights, and I was like, oh yeah, look, it's a bit stiff there. But if there is an acute event like that, I'd be more like, okay, let's actually go. We know there's an event, maybe then care seeking is an option, especially if you're not in the case of me, who has some anatomy knowledge, some biomechanics knowledge, whatever fuck you want to call this knowledge, in terms of human movement. So I'm like, all right, I know what has likely happened and how to deal with that.
Yeah, it's definitely not fair to expect a member of the general population to just have the exact same reaction as you or response as you, because they're unsure. They've heard things like, oh, I slipped a disc, this needs to be intervened surgically immediately or whatever. They hear these things and you're thinking, oh my God, is this a really bad thing? And in some cases, obviously, there are alarm bells that ring up that should make you think, maybe I should seek care. If you squat down to the bottom, you roll over on your ankle, and suddenly it's swollen, it's bruised, or you've got a bone sticking out. You've got severe pain. Like in those cases, obviously you should be seeking care. You should be trying to, at the very least, rule out something like a fracture, and likely, get appropriate care thereafter. Or in Paddy's case, if he was trying to go to the bathroom after and he noticed, oh, I've got foot drop, I've lost power in one leg or both legs, or I've got, lots of numbness and tingling down my legs or in my saddle region around the perineum. If you've got problems like that, or you're retaining urine, etc., they're all kind of red flag symptoms that can be a little bit worse. So yeah, this isn't the podcast for going through all that stuff. Paddy's case is just an example. This is going to be more of a general discussion of things like self-efficacy, self-reliance, resilience, independence, etc. So first things first, why would we want to promote these types of characteristics in our clients? Because I'm going to start by focusing on coaches, because that helps you to understand, why it's important for you as an individual. Because first of all, as a coach, as a personal trainer, or as a healthcare professional, there's some degree of like varying depending on whether you're a healthcare professional or a private personal trainer. There's some degree of financial interest in you getting new clients. Okay. That's just the reality of the situation. You getting new clients, you retaining clients over time, is basically how you make your living. Okay. So what you have to think about is, what does that actually incentivize? Okay. Because obviously if a client signs up with Triage, I want them to stay for as long as possible, because that means that they're paying more money. That's clearly an incentive that is there, and there's no point denying that. However, there are also other things that you want to be considering, in terms of coaching quality. Okay. Because what we want to do at Triage, especially, we have a kind of a clear mission statement when it comes to what we're doing with our coaching, that allows us to kind of override those incentives and ensure that we're not just engaging in poor coaching practices to get the most money out of people, because that's clearly not good practice. So what we try to do is effectively coach in such a way that people can get to the point where they no longer need us. Okay. That's our ultimate goal. Okay. And that means that, yeah, okay, maybe you're not going to get the most amount of money out of a person, because you're not trying to achieve that as your primary goal. That's not the goal. But if you want to think of things in terms of like the financial side of things, you could say that, when you get your testimonials from your clients, if they're saying that, oh yeah, after 3 months with working with Gary or Paddy, I felt like I was able to totally take charge of my own training and nutrition. I'm so happy I signed up. That can get you more clients down the line. So if you're worried about the financial side of things, you're an early career personal trainer, you're trying to get people to stay for as long as possible, just note that by playing the long game, by promoting these sorts of characteristics, it can still definitely be in your interest. So with that in mind, you can see how starting to promote things like independence, self-reliance, self-efficacy in your clients is something that has its benefits. Because if someone finishes after 3 months, or two people finish after 3 months, one client is in a position where they've gotten great results, or let's say both of them got great results. One of them followed your program to a T. They never asked any questions. They just kind of ate whatever, you told them to eat. They followed the meal plan, etc. They got unreal results. But when they finish up with you, they're now in a position where they're unsure of the training principles that got them those results. They're unsure of the basic nutrition principles that got them those results. And they're ultimately still just following a meal plan that you gave them without educating them as to why they should be following that meal plan. They're now in a position where they're not actually able to continue getting those results, even though it's after the coaching period. And you could say that, okay, they'll come back and they might get great results again. That's ultimately not our goal as coaches. Whereas another individual, what they might have done was got the exact same results, or even worse results in some cases. Let's say they got worse results, because I still think it becomes more of a positive if that person, let's say, they lost 2 less kilos, but over the subsequent 3 months, they actually make even more progress than the other individual, because they understood the nutrition principles. Let's say they were calorie tracking. They understand, what's in different foods now. They're able to track things. They're able to eyeball things. From a training perspective, they're rotating in different exercises every now and then, but they understand, how many sets they should roughly be doing, how many days they're going to train per week, things like how close they should be training to failure, all those sorts of things. And now when they're in a position where they're not just making progress for those 3 months, they're actually making progress for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, years down the line. And ultimately, the key point I want to get across in this podcast is that personal trainers should ultimately view themselves as health promoters, okay, as frontline healthcare professionals. I don't think the personal training industry standard on average is in a place where we would call them frontline healthcare professionals, but I think that's ultimately the standard we should be trying to hold ourselves to, that should be the goal, that we're ultimately playing a role of, by intervening with exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle interventions, that we're preventing someone from being in the healthcare system earlier in their life and for more of their life and for more severe conditions, ultimately trying to improve lifespan in terms of number of years lived, and health span in terms of the quality of those years lived, disease-free years, etc. So that is the role of a personal trainer. Despite the fact that we kind of see the short-term effects, we need to consider the long-term effects. And by promoting resilience, by educating our clients, by promoting self-reliance, self-efficacy, etc., we can make sure that those effects that we have within the 3 months that we work with the client, that they actually last long into the future, rather than just for that period of time. So there's some of the initial thoughts I would have in this topic.
Yeah, like there's a few things just to launch on from there.
Yeah.
Like I always look at it again, like comparing it to the healthcare system. Like say for again, like I'm injured now or whatever, right? If I was to go to a physio and I was just left in a position where I'm still going to the physio in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, not to say that there aren't actually, valid reasons why potentially you could and should be going to the physio for 2 years, but just say for me, for example, if I'm just going to a physio and the physio is like, yeah, the only actual intervention I'm doing is an intervention that basically means you have to come into me once per week indefinitely, like that's not a long-term solution for me, because what happens when like, oh, I don't have enough money to go this month, or I'm away or whatever, like there's breaks in it, or I'm just like, oh look, you're not actually getting your results 6 months down the line, I'm still in pain or whatever, that's not like that. I'm not going to recommend that physio ever again. I'm going to be like, they didn't get me any resolution. It just seemed like they were bringing me in, giving me a rub or something while I was there, and like I didn't get anything from it. Like I got some momentary relief from it, from the pain, and then it was straight back. And it was just, they didn't educate me on like, do these stretches or do these exercises, or do these movements, strengthen these areas, or avoid doing these movements until you can do this. Like they didn't give me a return to play playbook or whatever guide, so that's not like, you wouldn't want that, like if I'm trying to get resolution to my back pain, like that's not the person I'm going to go to. Right? So why would you think it's going to be the person you should go to for your health and fitness stuff? Like, oh, I go to this one person and they're saying, okay, they're going to help me get to a place of self-reliance and an educated position where, in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, again, there's definitely, I've had clients for 2 years and then we move on to the, self-reliance thing. But like, there's definitely positions where you go for a longer period of time. But if I'm going against the person that's like, oh yeah, I'm going to try to get you to a position where you're self-reliant, and all these testimonials and all the people that I talked to that coached from you were like, yeah, really educated me, really helped me, navigate the food environment, navigate the training environment. So I knew what to do, and they weren't like stringing me along, just looking at me as like a wallet, or you go to the person that's like, yeah, look, I just train my clients when I'm there, and there's no education, there's no like showing them what the principles are, there's none of that, like it becomes clear who you would actually want to go to if you compare that again to the physio example, so again, if you are a coach listening to this, like be thinking long term with how you actually are approaching clients. And obviously we're going to get into like a few more, like let's say, specifics in terms of show you what we actually mean, rather than just being like, oh, yeah, self-efficacy, self-reliance, like that's just vague terms,
Yeah.
But you want to have a client that is empowered, because if they know, like you're effectively helping them on their fitness journey, you know, and you don't want to be coaching them when they're 90, you know, like you just don't. Like I actually love my clients, but I don't want to be talking to them the next 30 years being like, all right, we're doing the exact same thing. Yeah, okay, we're just going to tweak these, you know, like I don't want to be doing that. I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think that's a good like coaching practice, you know. I'd rather them just fucking check back in with me in 30 years and be like, yeah, look, I'm 60 years old now and I've had phenomenal results, phenomenal health my whole life, and it's all thanks to you helping me with my diet and my training. You know, I've kept it up, blah blah blah. I'm like, I'd much rather see that, you know, than me checking in with them every single week, or you know, coaching them every single week and whatever else. Now, again, obviously there are certain circumstances where you probably are going to coach someone longer term because they have, you know, limitations or whatever. But again, even though there is that obviously monetary incentive to be like, I want to keep these people on because they're paying me, we need to be thinking beyond that. You know, again, if we, as we said, if we want to have this healthcare focus or frontline healthcare perspective on our industry, then we need to actually transition to having practices that reflect that. You know, like you could argue, if you are so inclined, that the medical healthcare system is somewhat, you know, money aligned, where they're like, oh yeah, they're just trying to keep you coming in, you know. Like I don't think that is the case. Like if you break your leg, they're not going to be like, yeah, you're going to be coming in for the next 6 years, you know, for surgeries or whatever. Like again, you might, but there's going to be a thing where it's like, okay, look, your transition, you're off our books, like, you know, see you later, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like the place that this comes up most often, or is the clearest, is definitely in the case of injury. And we will go through other examples with training and nutrition, but in the case of pain and injury, because I work with a lot of clients who do have some sort of pain or injury or rehab goal when they initially sign up, and that is something that I see a lot. This is something that does come up as a pro during the coaching process, because what will happen? Something along the lines of, right, early on, maybe someone has some complaints in their shoulder or complaints in their knee or their back or whatever, and they're saying, they might check in and they'll say, or they won't even check in. They'll message me immediately during the week. They're like, Gary, hurt my knee during training today. What should I do? Thinking of going to the physio. Really concerned. Let me know ASAP. Okay, so that's like early on in the process. Whereas what might happen later on is that it'll be an end of week check-in, and they'll say, hey Gary, knee flared up there on Tuesday. Basically what I did a couple of less sets and I stayed further from failure. And then for the rest of the week, I just kept my squats lighter, feeling much better now. That is the biggest win I could possibly get in coaching, because one, I didn't do anything. And two, they did everything, you know, and they were in a position where they were comforted by their own knowledge, and that they were able to say, I know this isn't that big a deal. But not only that, they were also able to make the decisions to move forward without having to seek care. So that obviously saves them money, and potentially a lot of money, because what can actually happen here sometimes is that individual, they might go in for to see their GP, let's say, and their GP says, oh, I'm concerned, I'm going to refer you for an MRI. And then you get your MRI booking, and then they find that there's a degenerative meniscal tear. And you don't know what that means, because why would you? You don't know about the success of surgery versus conservative care, etc. And then that degenerative meniscal tear, you end up undergoing a surgery for that. Okay, so more time out of training, and then follow up physio for that. So clearly, like if you're paying for all those things, the financial cost is building up significantly. But you're also now in a position where you're ill and you're a patient, even though you were previously just a casual kind of trainee, you know. And it might even be the case that you've now undertaken a surgery that may not have even benefited you versus just conservative care, because that does happen in some cases. So you can see
Even
how
though,
this
just on
can.
that as well, like the
Go
longer
ahead.
term thing as well, because you can also have a position where people are like, no, you should never lift again. You
Yeah,
like,
even worse.
like, and you just like, it's just reckless, you know. Like, yeah, okay, maybe you have to modify things, to go around. Maybe, I don't know, you got screws in your spine or some shit, you know. It's like, yeah, cool. Like you might have to work around some limitations. Don't do this exercise, or, you know, do this exercise instead, or whatever. But if you make someone weaker long term, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't mean just like strength as in like, you know, gym strength. I mean like even psychologically, it's like, oh no, you should never do, no, don't move. Like you need to move like a tin man. Like a gust of wind could, you know, destroy everything we've put together for you. You know, like that's not a good position. That's not where you want to be as an individual, or, you know, if you are coaching individuals in this kind of rehab capacity.
Yeah, and the straw man that one would create if they were trying to argue against this point is that they'd say, so you're just saying that people should just keep going and get on with it. That's absolutely not the case. What we are suggesting is that someone, when they have these initial, you know, bouts of pain or whatever, that they're educated on what they should actually do with their training, with their lifestyle, etc., to try and overcome it. And then if it doesn't get better and it's continuing to worse, or to get worse, of course, yes, you know, seek care. You might need to make further changes. But if that client that I was working with, that they were able to turn around, you know, 12 weeks into the coaching process and say, hey, I made these decisions and I'm 70% better already in the space of 5 days, then that's a huge win, because they didn't actually end up in the healthcare system and didn't end up exposed to all the potential risks that are associated with that. You know, obviously we like to think of healthcare and care seeking as being something that is just purely positive, but that's absolutely not the case. People can be overdiagnosed for things that aren't necessarily real problems. People can, you know, end up taking or end up getting certain interventions that may not even benefit them, that may benefit them, but there's always risks associated with every intervention, whether it be a drug or surgery, etc. So ultimately, if you can have things in place that stop you from ending up on that pathway when it's not necessary, then that is a huge win. Okay. So that's something that I always try to bring in to my coaching practice, is that when someone gets injured, they have some sort of pain, I'm not just thinking, how can I ensure that this is resolved ASAP? I'm trying to think, okay, what can I tell the person, or what do they need to know about this situation, so that they don't actually end up in this position in future where they respond the exact same and it's not actually a superior response. And that might include things that, and obviously I don't expect every personal trainer to do this, I'm just giving you examples. This might include things like, right, someone has gone for that MRI, let's say, and they say, okay, there's a degenerative meniscal tear, that I might present information to that individual saying, right, these are actually present in a lot of asymptomatic people. Here's the percentage of people your age that these are present in. Here's the success of interventions, and here's the success of, you know, just kind of managing it conservatively in terms of exercise. And here's the number of people who are actually athletes that train with these all the time. That's not a big deal, you know. That's the type of information I give to people, because then what that lets them know is that, oh, right, this isn't just some big scary thing that happened to me and that is 100% associated with my pain, because that can happen a lot of the time. For example, if Paddy was to go and get an MRI in his spine at the moment, we know that Paddy has back pain, and then if Paddy was to go and get that MRI, they might find lots of different things that are in the spine, different problems, etc. And it mightn't even be clear that they're problems. We can't necessarily infer that they're the cause of Paddy's pain, because they may have been there previously. And that's what ends up happening a lot of the time with pain and injury and scans, etc. So again, not saying you shouldn't go and get a scan when it's justified, not saying you shouldn't seek care when it's justified. Rather, I'm saying that as a personal trainer, even if you can give people strategies to manage increases in pain when they do begin to present themselves, I think that can be a really, really positive thing. So, like, obviously we've discussed this in previous podcasts about managing pain and injury, but it could be something like, right, when your client has, you know, the complaining, oh, you know, my shoulder's a little bit niggly this week, it's not as good as it was last week. You might simply say to them, okay, let's take the exercises that is aggravating the shoulder, and let's take one set away next week. Let's stay 2 to 3 reps from failure instead of the 0 to 1 reps that we were doing last week. And let's reduce range of motion a little bit on the bench press, because that seems to be the exercise that's provoking it the most. Then what we'll do is we'll review next week. We'll see how it is. If it's improving, we'll keep those changes going for 1 more week. And if you're kind of 90% better, we'll try to reintroduce things as normal. Does that sound like a plan? boom, it's clear. It's clear that the person has made a plan. It's clear that there's not only a plan in place, but there's also points that we can review at, that we're going to say in 2 weeks, if not this, then this. Because you might say that, right, if things are worsening, we actually should, seek physio or seek a GP or whatever, and then we refer out. So yeah, they're the types of examples where this does come into practice in the case of pain and injury. But I don't want to focus solely on that, because it does go a lot broader.
Yeah, I just
You
wanted to
want to
say,
say something?
like, first of all, Gary's going to cover a lot of this stuff in the coach's corner. So if you're not in there, just saying. Um, but yeah, I actually think it's easier to see this for just general population or coaches if you just talk about it in the context of training and nutrition. Because obviously, with injuries, people are like, oh, I don't really know about this one. I'll go to physio straight
Which
away.
is fair enough. It's
Which
fair enough.
100%, that's definitely, if you're a lay person and you've no idea about anatomy or anything body related, like, go to someone that you can probably
Yeah.
trust, um like, that's just common sense, but in the case of like training and nutrition, it's a little bit easier to see how building like that self-efficacy and knowing what to do in situations. Obviously, again, if you're a layperson, you're not going to know what to do in every single situation, but having a principle guiding framework of how to deal with situations, that's what we want to give to people that are engaging in coaching. Like, it's like, oh, well, what do I do in this nutritional situation, or what do I do in this training situation? Let's give some guiding principles so that we can navigate them. For example, like, I'll just give an example for training and nutrition. So with training, say you are an athlete, you do GAA, you do sport, and you're also going to the gym, right? And you have a plan. You're like, all right, this is my plan. I have 3 days of resistance training, and I have 3 days of, 2 days of GA training, and a game, on the weekend, right? And you have your week planned out. You're like, this is the days I'm going to do this, this, and this, all great, happy days. And then your game gets changed, and now it's on a Thursday evening when normally you wouldn't have training then, or whatever, So a self-reliant or self-efficacious individual is going to be like, all right, cool, I know the general gist of what we're trying to achieve with this training program in this given week, and I also know the resistance training principles that are guiding this, and then I also know how to modify this so that I can be where I want to be, top form for my game, because that's obviously the more important thing in the week. So I'm not like battering myself with legs that are lower body the day before, So you're like, this was the plan of action going into the week. This is how I'm going to tweak it. Either you're changing the days around, you're like, all right, I'm just going to tweak the format of the days around so that it makes sense now that my week has changed, my week structure has changed. Or you're doing something like changing the volume, the reps, the sets, or the intensity of that. Again, maybe you're using RPE or reps in reserve, or just like, oh, that feels heavier, you're changing, you're modulating the volume, the intensity, and maybe even the overall exercise load, in terms of, you might be like, right, I'm just going to do two of these 4 exercises I was going to do, just because they're the big hitter ones and I want to keep them in. But I know these exercises generally cause me some DOMs a little bit more. Maybe it's like a lunge or something, or something that gets you into a really like lengthened position. You're like, look, that always does give me a little bit of DOMs. It's a very effective exercise for me, but with what I have going on, I'm just going to leave it out. Like, how to structure your week, how to modify your week, you know how to do that if something comes up, you miss a session, like you have the understanding so that you can navigate the training landscape and be like, yeah, I know what to do. If this happens, again, there's going to be random things that pop up. Maybe you train in the evening and, I don't know, something came up during the day and it's like you didn't get to the gym until an hour later. So you now have, I don't know, the gym closes in 40 minutes and you're like, okay, what do I need to change so that I can get a good effective workout in that 40 minutes? Like, there's all these little things, they come up, right? So you need to know how to navigate that and not be relying on someone else to navigate it for you. However, there is that position, and this is where like coaching comes in. Like, I effectively see it as like, you're holding someone's hand down the path. You're showing them how to walk on this path, you know? Or you can think of it like a boat. You're the one rowing the boat at the moment while coaching is going on. But all the time you're rowing the boat, you're showing the individual how to row the boat, because you're like, I'm going to get off once we get to this point. So you're going to be in charge of rowing the boat, you know? Like, obviously they're not going to know everything once they finish coaching or throughout the coaching process. However, it is that slow accumulation of more and more knowledge, and that slow accumulation of, okay, so this is how we navigate this is how we navigate that, this is how you should potentially be thinking about what needs to be done versus what we can kind of go, okay, we can drop that out if needs be, and how to modify things. So I think it's kind of easier to see with the training. It's even easier to see with the nutrition stuff, because, like, again, if we're in a position where it's like, most people on the weekends, they might have a different, you know, eating schedule than when they're in work Monday to Friday, you know. So we need to know how to navigate that, just first of all, because most people end up like binge eating on the weekend. Like, that's probably the most common eating pattern in, you know, humans. It's like, yeah, Monday to Friday we eat relatively lower calories, and then on the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you know, it's higher calories, you know. So we need to know how to navigate that, just from the perspective of, oh, we want to stay on track, but also from the perspective of, there's probably more events in terms of, you know, christenings, confirmations, weddings, whatever, you know, but also just, you know, nights out and meals out with friends, family, especially after all this crazy COVID stuff. More people are kind of like, oh, well, I wanted to see my friends and family, haven't seen them for a while, let's have a small gathering, you know. Again, you need to know how to navigate that with your nutrition. Like, are there plans in place? So maybe we're eating a little bit lower calories the days leading up to it. Maybe we are, you know, on that day, we have an idea of what we're going to order in the restaurant, or, you know, drinks or whatever it is. Maybe you're like, okay, well, that means I need to get a little bit more protein earlier in the day, a little bit less carbs, or a little bit less fats, whatever, right? But you have protocols in place. You know, you as an individual, you know how to navigate that food landscape so that you're staying still relatively on track with, you know, the calories and macros, for example, that you want to hit, or, you know, the overall diet proportions that you want to hit, you know. And obviously there's multiple ways that you can, you know, coach nutrition. But whatever way you are actually going through that nutrition process, you are coming up with some sort of protocol, some sort of plan to be able to navigate all of these things that come up. You know, again, maybe you prepare all your food in advance, and, you know, you're in work and you realize, oh, I forgot my lunchbox. You know, like, how am I going to navigate that? You just not eat now, you know, and couldn't stick to my like rigid meal plan, so I guess I'm not sticking to it, and give me whatever. You know, you don't have a plan of action. You don't know why that meal was a good meal for you, like why it was getting results. So you're like, I don't know anything about the meal, so I'm just going to eat whatever, you know. I couldn't, you know. So I think it's kind of easier to see with the nutrition and the training, how being, you know, self-reliant and self-efficacious makes a lot of sense from a coaching perspective to get an individual to that point. And that takes time. That's an extra thing that you have to do in the coaching process, like help educate the person, help them understand what they need to focus on and what needs to be done. But it does take time to get to that position. But as an individual, it also takes time to get to that position, you know. Like, you're not just going to have it, pick it up overnight and be like, yeah, look, I learned about calories and macros. Look, it's actually too easy now. I can just go in, eat anything I want. Once it fits in my calories and macros, happy days. Because people do think that, and then they realize down the road, they're like, wow, this is actually a lot harder to actually hit these targets. You know, they'll be like, basically wing it most of the day, and then it'll come 7 o'clock and they're like, wow, I actually have to eat 150 grams of protein right now, you know. And it's like, that was because poor planning throughout the whole day, because you don't have the understanding of how to actually navigate the food environment, you know. And obviously when you're coaching this, there's multiple ways to go about doing this. And like, there's like throwing people in the deep end and letting them kind of swim themselves, which is something I actually like doing, because it helps teach them, and they start understanding stuff. Like, again, they get to the end of the day and they're like, whoa, well, like, I have 150 grams of protein to eat. So then you're like, let's talk through this, and you now realize that planning out your meals ahead of time, it makes a lot of sense, because situations like this happen, and then it's harder to hit your calorie targets or your macronutrient targets or whatever it is, and then you start coaching them on how to actually navigate that over time. But there's also a more of a hand-holding method, in terms of you give them pretty much everything at the start, and then you pull things away, which is another way you can do it, in terms of, you're like, right, here's a meal plan, we're going to stick with this, let's start transitioning away from a meal plan then, in a few weeks, where it's like, I want you to choose a meal that is similar to this meal in terms of calories and the macros, and you're basically educating them on how to eat similar to the meal plan, what's making the meal plan work. There's multiple ways to actually go about doing this, and especially as you get longer term with a client, like, you might do things like, right, we're actually just going to take a month's break from coaching. You have a few things going on this month, and I think you can navigate them on your own, and I think it's good to just be able to go out on your own and stay on track, because it teaches them. You find the failure points. They might be like, look, I actually found it really hard to deal with this, or not having the weekly accountability or whatever it is, it really made it hard for me. So you find these failure points, you do basically a stress test, and then you go on back into coaching. You're like, right, we need to deal with these, so that the next time we stop working together, whether forever or for a month or whatever, these things are not going to be an issue. So there's multiple ways to navigate it. And again, I'm gonna just fucking sell, but these stuff will be discussed in the coach's corner. So yeah, if you're not in there, get in there.
Yeah, and like I think the thinking about your own kind of coaching philosophy is something that's quite interesting here, because like you said, there's the difference between the throwing the person in the deep end and the hand holding kind of method. And like, I definitely probably be biased towards just throwing people in the deep end. But that's mainly because personally I've always found that to be how I manage best in terms of situations, in terms of education, especially when it comes to like practical education, like from being on placement and stuff. And
Immersive learning, I think that's what they call
yeah,
it.
exactly. Just being totally immersed, being beyond your depths, and having to come up with strategies to deal with that. Because it's not like, the thing is, it's not just about having a client. Like, let's say when they sign up, I'm not thinking about how can I get this person to know everything they possibly can immediately, right? That's just not useful, okay? Because what we can do there is, I could get them to sign up. I'll send them, 10 documents that goes through every possible problem they could ever encounter. Like, that's not actually that useful, because what a more specific approach is for the individual to sign up, for me to give them, let's say, their training and nutrition guidelines, to cover the basics, obviously, of why I've made these training decisions. Here's, how to do the exercises. Here's, this is why we're tracking protein, carbs, and fat, etc. Obviously, I'm giving people plenty of information, but I don't want to cover everything, because what I want to know is that at the end of week 1 or week 2 or whatever, I want to know what they struggled with, because that allows us to actually get to the real problems. Because you don't want to address loads of problems that aren't actually problems, because I don't know necessarily every single client's level of nutrition education and previous experience when they sign up. They might give a rundown in their questionnaire initially, but it's not going to give me a complete understanding. Whereas if someone at the end of the first week, they come back and they say, Gary, I really struggled with hitting the protein target. It was above what I've been used to. I also found that the fiber was actually much higher than I've been used to as well. That was quite difficult. And steps, I previously thought that I was getting, an average of 10,000 steps, but it turns out my average is actually probably closer to 6, and that some days were just higher. So now what I've done there is, we've given initial guidelines that kind of gave them things to aim at, and now they've come back with the feedback to tell me that protein, fiber, and steps are the main things this person struggled with. So I need to focus on developing strategies for this individual that can overcome those problems. And now we've created a more specific, not just plan of action, but also education, because they're the things that the person struggles with. Because if someone is hitting their carbohydrates perfectly and their fat perfectly, and they, it's all great sources and everything, and their sleep is on point, then it's a waste of my time to send them, and their time, for me to spend a 10-minute video, let's say, discussing how to get enough sleep, when they're just like, yeah, but I've already got that down, so why would I worry about that, you know? So when you're thinking about that kind of immersive process, or throwing someone in the deep end, it's not just about making sure they find ways to overcome the problems. It's also about being able to identify the problems better. And that's ultimately about customization. And a similar thing would be, you know, if you're, let's say a student doctor, right? And next year I'm out on placement, and I have an educator, a doctor who's trying to educate me, and they give me the exact same stepwise process of walking me through holding my hand as someone else. Whereas the other medical student, their background is actually in psychology and mine is in physiotherapy, and we're in an orthopedic rotation. And I obviously have a bit of experience from a physio perspective on that. And they're educating me, holding my hand, being like, right, you know, so this is a person with back pain, and this is the prevalence of back pain, etc. And they start talking about exercise, etc. And they're educating me on exercise, and I'm like, wait, I'd actually rather, you know, you actually spent more time educating me on something else, because that would actually bring me up to a higher level. So it's about customization. You know, if someone's holding your hand and teaching you the exact same thing as they teach someone else, and starting from the start all the time, and not speeding up, not focusing on different things, that's not quality education. It's not individualized education. So that's ultimately what we want to get to with our clients. Now, with that said, that immersive kind of into the deep end approach, it's going to work better, at least a lot of the time, for people who have some sort of basis. You have to do more hand holding if someone is a complete beginner. If someone has no idea what they're doing, they've never stood foot in the gym, they've never tracked their nutrition, they've never even paid attention to what they were eating. Very clearly, in that case, you can't just give that person very vague guidelines in week one, like, yeah, you know, I want you to track your calories, and here's a 3-day program with no exercise tutorials, no cues, nothing, because they're like, I don't know what to do at all, you know. But there's still an element of into the deep end with that person, because you might give them a video on how to do the squat, that, you know, is very general, but it mightn't necessarily be specific to that person. So they're still going in, they still have to troubleshoot the squat, find different problems, and they might come back to you and say, my biggest problem was actually holding the bar. Whereas you could have spent all that time giving them cues for every single joint, which would have just been overdoing it, because the main problem they had was holding the bar. So that's the thing that you then address on week 2. So yeah, you can see how this does need to be considered on an individual basis. And that's obviously the art of coaching. That's obviously the difference here between just saying, this is the best way to coach, and, you know, this being an approach that you actually individualize for different clients. But I think if you can have that overall framework of putting self-efficacy, the person's independence, the person's long-term ability to manage their own training, nutrition, pain, injury, lifestyle, etc., both through education and through like them developing their own strategies as they move along, and them showing themselves what they can do. I think if you can do that, I think that makes you ultimately a far better coach in the long term. And despite the fact that you can be fooled by thinking the best approach is to just keep people on your coaching rota for as long as possible, I think ultimately longer term, it's a far better approach, even financially, to try to, you know, do the best for the individual, because it will come back to help you as well as a coach.
100%. So, okay, we've hopefully enlightened people in terms of building client coaching, self-efficacy is a good idea, and giving them some sort of framework of thinking about that. But how do we actually build that self-efficacy? Because we've mentioned like education, we've mentioned, you know, a more tailored coaching approach. But what does this actually look like in terms of how am I, you're coaching me, Gary, right? How are you getting me to a position where you're comfortable going, he can probably go out and coach himself? You know, how do you know? How do you get to that point? Like what are we hitting milestones? Are we hitting like landmarks? Like, well, how do you know? Like, obviously, a lot of it is going to be dictated. Like, oh well, I want to finish up coaching. I have, you know, a new job, or college, or whatever. I feel I'm pretty confident in knowing what to do. And obviously, there's going to be a case where when you finish up, it's like, yeah, like, feel free to ask questions in the future. Like, drop me an email or whatever. Like, that's
Mhm.
just Fair enough. Like, um, but how do you get me to that point, and how do you know I'm at that point?
One of the biggest things for me, because obviously we've discussed specific examples already, so I'm not going to go over like the start of the coaching process, etc., over again, and the pain stuff, the injury stuff. One of the biggest things that I think is definitely underrated, um, is collaborative decision making. And this is something that I bring into the coaching process more and more over time, the longer someone's been working with me. Because at the beginning, it's going to be more of a dictatorship. It's going to be more of a case of, I'm going to make these decisions for you in terms of training and nutrition because we need to start somewhere. And clearly, by virtue of the fact that you've signed up for coaching, you're not sure of where that point is. Okay, cool, no problem. Let's set your training program. I'll make an estimate of what's likely to be the best plan of action at the moment for your training, nutrition, and lifestyle. But as we move along, let's say we're 6 weeks in, we're making some program changes. The person might be giving me lots of feedback, and they're like, they're providing lots of feedback, and I might ask them, just what have you enjoyed? Very, very simple questions at the beginning. What have you enjoyed in terms of exercises? What didn't you enjoy? Boom, that's a bit of feedback. Okay. And then as that moves along, let's say we're 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the line, what I might start asking are more specific things like, right, so this program or this phase of training went really well, but do you have any suggestions as to how we could change to the next phase? What do you think might work well? And obviously it's not the case of me just letting the person make all the decisions, the client make all the decisions, but it's rather the case that I want to see where they're at in terms of how they're making decisions, but I'm also trying to get them to the point where they're able to make the decisions, and sometimes their suggestions might actually give me new information that I wasn't aware of. They might say that, look, Gary, the hack squat was actually great. I really enjoyed the hack squat, but one of the problems is that in my gym, it's real busy. Let's say it's real busy, and people love using the hack squat. And you suggested that I use a reverse band on the hack squat, but I actually don't like doing that because it's awkward to set up, and etc. All these different types of information. And they might say that while I enjoyed the hack squat, I actually personally find that when I do a barrel back squat, I get more psyched. I get more pumped about the session. I look forward to it. I like the numbers aspect. So I think that in my own training, I'd like to have a bit more of a numbers focus in terms of tracking things like strength, even though my goal is hypertrophy. If someone comes back and says that to me, I'm like, boom, that's amazing, because I'm not able to get all that out of you all the time. And you might be missing those things as a coach. So if you're not asking questions, you're not getting the right information. And by bringing people into that collaborative decision-making process, you force them to think through this stuff. You force them to think about what they would do if they were in such a situation. And then that ultimately sets them up for the future as well. So yeah, I think giving your clients some responsibility can be really helpful. The same thing when it comes to nutrition. What I might say to people early on, it might be very basic things like, what are your preferences? If you're sitting down for a meal, is it generally going to be like a kind of a more meat or animal based meal? You like animal foods in general. Maybe you like higher fat foods. You're the type of person that's like, if you were to sit down for a meal, it'd be things like chorizo, mature cheddar, dark chocolate, those kind of rich flavors. Or are you someone who's like, I just love rice? Those types of things might actually influence our decision making, because, right, I know what your taste preferences are. Boom, that's simple. We can start to make sure that your macronutrients are set up in such a way that facilitates that. Whereas longer term, it might be the case that I should give you more of the reins, where we're saying, right, your fat loss has stalled. What do you think we should do? Okay, like real open-ended. And the person might say, I think that we should reduce calories a bit, but hunger has been a real obstacle for me. I feel like it might be compromising my adherence a bit. So maybe we could just make a small drop, and maybe I could do a better job in terms of being a bit more rigid with my tracking, making sure I'm not snacking, etc. So if someone comes back with that feedback again, I'm like, that is a huge win, because the person has shown to me that they're thinking about all the things that I would be thinking about. And if the person comes back, obviously, like with this collaborative decision-making process, one of your roles as a coach is that if the person is not coming back with information that you think is correct, then that's your opportunity for education, again, preparing that person for the future. So overall, I think bringing people into the decision-making process as a coach, as a healthcare professional, I think can really start to help them to get to a position where they're able to make those decisions for themselves longer term. So that's one of my biggest things.
Yeah, I think basically creating an environment where you can talk openly with your clients, like actually
Yeah.
have a conversation as if, like obviously at the start, you treat them like children, basically. You're like, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this, right? But then as you get through the coaching process and they're like, okay, yeah, I understood why we were doing this, but I actually preferred this. And you can actually listen to that. And it's not just a case of you're like, of course you prefer eating more calories, like like
Yeah.
but like they're actually just like, yeah, I actually wouldn't mind. I find it easier to stick to if my protein is a little bit higher, or my carbs or my fats, or whatever it is. They're just like, oh, or also like, I know we have been having like pretty steady calories throughout the every single day, but I find it easier to eat in a calorie deficit while I'm in work, and I wouldn't mind having a few more calories to play with at the weekend, like different things like that. Like, you're not going to find that information out unless you build that relationship and actually talk to the individual, and also create an environment where they can ask questions. Like in our intro, like to coaching emails and stuff, it's like, all right, this, like, I want you to know, like, asking a million questions is good, like that's, I want you to realize that and know that, like in my one, I literally repeated like 3 times. I'm like, ask a million questions, like ask questions. Because I always ultimately look at it, I'm like, look, this is a service you're paying for. You might as well get the absolute most of the service, like milk it for all it is worth, and the only way you can do that is by asking questions. So they have to feel comfortable asking questions. Now, again, depending on how exactly you coach, if you are a coach, like that's obviously going to be different, and you might be like, right, you can ask me a million questions, but just do it on this day or when we're in the gym or whatever it is, and obviously if you're an individual, like it's a little bit harder to ask questions because you don't have someone to ask questions. Oh wait, you actually have a question box below that you could easily ask questions in. But anyway, so like, I think basically building that relationship and that environment where it is a collaborative approach, and it's always moving towards that collaboration in terms of, like, I can't feel what you can feel. Like, I give you an exercise and I go, yeah, this is supposed to work the quads, you might be like, right, wow, I actually feel my glutes great in this exercise, like I can't feel that. There's no way for me to be able to feel that. Not that we should be putting a huge amount of emphasis in terms of how an exercise feels in terms of it's like hypertrophic or strength response or whatever, but that's still valuable information. If you're just like, oh yeah, actually I do squats and I feel like I'm leaning over to my left-hand side loads, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, I don't really see that, it's still information that I need to make better decisions going forward, so you need to have an environment that the person can communicate with you, and you can ask questions, they can ask questions, and effectively build that collaboration so that you can get to a point where they're effectively coaching themselves. That's what I always look for. I'm like, you're basically telling me, you're like, yeah, I think a lower rep block of training would make sense. Like, say people, I had like coaching them over COVID and stuff. We were doing obviously more higher reps because we've got body weight stuff and bands, and like it's not exactly great for doing a 6-rep max or something, so coming out of that, I had a few clients that were like, yeah, I wouldn't mind getting back to a little bit of lower rep training, and I want to build some strength on this exercise and this exercise, but I also want to build some muscle here and here, and I feel like I lost a bit of muscle here. And they're basically telling me how they want to see the program designed, but also they're telling me in a way that I'm like, look, you're kind of ready to go on your own with coaching. Like, you know what I'm going to give you. You know the training plan. Yeah, you might not know all the specifics, and you might be like, oh, I'm not really, like, they're still wanting to outsource that, all of the thinking, and they might be like, all right, I would never program this for myself, but I know it's good for me, or whatever it is. So it's not to say that the coaching necessarily ends when you feel that the individual is self-sufficient. They could go out and do it themselves, but we want to get them to that position where it is that collaboration. Like, if you are a coach, you're effectively talking to a peer, rather than talking to a child, where you're like, oh yeah, like you talk to a child, obviously you're going to talk to them differently than if you're talking to another adult and you're like, yeah, we can actually have, and like an adult that's in your industry knows all the stuff that you know. It's like, obviously that's a different conversation style and conversation entirely, and than if you're just talking to someone that you're like, look, I need to be able to help you get information. You're just new on the job. We need to get you to the position where you know all the stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I also just want to add that if you're an early career coach, you're kind of just getting into things, it is harder to do that. And I completely appreciate all this, because there are going to be cases where, if you start telling your clients to ask all the questions, and you let them make all the decisions and stuff, you're actually not in a position comfortable enough with your level of education to be able to like be so comfortable with all those answers and with all that information, to be flexible and everything, because you might be in more of a place at the moment where you actually have some things that work for you, but you're not entirely sure of why. You're kind of in that learning process. Maybe you did a personal training course, you know a good bit about exercise, but maybe your nutrition isn't up to scratch. So I appreciate that, like, this is coming from the perspective of us who have coached for years and spent a lot of time on education, and that it is much easier when you've gone through that process. But over time, this is something you should be moving towards. So what I would say to you is that if you're early on as a personal trainer, you don't have to feel like, right, immediately let's start doing everything that they're suggesting here, but it's something to aim at. So it's something to think about when you're thinking of what is a good coach, that you think, okay, I want to get to the point where I'm able to collaboratively make decisions with my clients, because sometimes it can be challenging. If you're a personal trainer and let's say you're coaching, let's say a physiotherapist or something like that, or you might be coaching a nutritionist, so a couple of my clients have degrees in nutrition. If I was an early career personal trainer and we were starting to do collaborative decision making on nutrition, they might actually have more knowledge than me on a lot of things. So being aware of those things, maintaining your humility, and being able to turn around when someone does ask a question and say, hey, look, I'm not actually sure, but next week I'm going to try and get you a better answer, if that's okay. People do like that. And I think that if you can be humble as a personal trainer early on, I think that will make it easier to eventually get to this point of collaborative decision making, because it is a case of insecurity with some coaches. Some people who have been in the industry for years, who are very rigid in the way that they approach things. They often will tell their clients, this is the way we do things. And if they ask questions, it's kind of a case of, oh, this is just what we do. We do sets of 6 to 8. Like, that's just what we do. So yeah, don't be dogmatic with your approach. Allow your clients into the decision-making process. Don't hold hands, but do give support as needed. And don't always throw people in the deep end, but do push them in a little bit. I think that's a sound conclusion to
Yeah,
this
I'm not
overall
really asked to
podcast.
say on this. Like, obviously, this is a much bigger discussion.
Yeah,
Like,
it's a meta topic. You can get into all the specifics.
exactly, it's a huge thing. But if they wanted to find out more information about like this kind of topic and stuff, where would they go?
Yeah, so as most of you will be aware at this point, you've been listening to the podcast. At the end of this month, the plan is to launch the Coach's
No, not
Corner.
even at the end of this month. Before the end of the month, 2 weeks.
2 weeks. There you go. We're going to be launching the Coach's Corner, which is a platform designed for the education of personal trainers, primarily. And basically, it's going to be a continuing education platform rather than like a primary education platform. So, the intent is to give you all the information, related to things like anatomy and physiology, that sort of stuff, nutrition theory, but more so bring it to the point where you're actually applying it. So, giving you different case studies, talking through things like this. How do you actually, if you have a client that signs up and you think they have very low self-efficacy, they're very dependent on you, how do you bring them from that point to being a more independent individual? So all those different types of things, applied coaching practice, that's what it's all going to be about. And decision making, that's ultimately the name of the game. Information, applying it, making decisions, implementation and implementation, that's going to be the Coach's Corner. So if you are interested in that, you can pre-register your interest below. You'll be put on a wait list and you'll get an exclusive discount once that is launched. So that would be a good idea if you are a coach who wants to improve your level of education, improve the service that you provide. So that's that. If you are interested in just kind of keeping up with what we're doing, you can join the Triage Method newsletter. That's our weekly newsletter. And that is basically going to provide you with interesting interesting content from around the internet that we've come across. Also some exclusive content that doesn't go elsewhere. So we write a little post or article, or share a research paper or whatever, and give a bit of a rundown on that within the newsletter, and also provide all the content that we've shared throughout the week. So different content we've been producing. If you've been struggling to follow on social media, that's a good place to get a kind of a catch-all of what's been going on. And the Triage Method community is also our free open access Facebook group, and you get a lot of the same benefits in there. You know, if I find an interesting paper, I might share it in there and say, hey, look, this is an interesting paper. Here's why I thought it was interesting. Here's, you know, why you might think it's interesting. Boom, done. Similarly, we share all of our content in there that we've been producing, and people ask questions. We have different discussions. We share some excerpts from the Coach's Corner. So that's a good place to be. If you are interested in coaching with us, in that you want to sign up for coaching, we do have spaces available, and you can find information about that below. And if you just like to follow along with our content in general, we've got the Instagram, the Facebook at Triage Method, YouTube, Triage Method, and of course the Triage Method podcast, which we recommend you subscribe to and leave a rating and review if you would be so kind.
Wonderful, Gary. You are such a good salesperson.
Like a poet.
Anyway, I have literally nothing else to say. So it is too easy, Gary.
It's too easy.